Hello everyone, my name is Ben and welcome back to Pass the Aux Cord, a channel where I really need to start getting to these in a more timely manner. But with that being said, today's video is going to be the recap of the last month, where I'm going to be talking about some albums that I did not get to over the course of the last 30 days or so, and I didn't make a main video on them exclusively dedicated to it, but I would like to point your way nonetheless. It was kind of a dry month for releases this last month, probably because of obvious circumstances at this point, but we did see some interesting stuff, and I'm only kind of covering about one album a week that's new. So here's a few things that I did miss and I still think are interesting. Animal Collective, Bridge to Quiet. Animal Collective is a band that I have always been pretty fond of, but a little bit mixed on from time to time. Usually I'm a fan of their wild sonic oddities that they put to record though. I was somewhat surprised to see this release spanning only 4 tracks and a whole 34 minutes. It's looking very ambitious, and wow, ambitious it was. These 4 songs are an adventure unlike I've really heard from another record. It's psychedelically nightmarish and simultaneously blissfully dreamlike. Animal Collective has always seemed like an otherworldly affair, but this manages to transport you to soundscapes you only vaguely remember from the past, and even the events that never actually happened. This densely textured atmosphere is certain to send you on a journey, as this band tends to do. I always encourage listening to music to just be the only thing you're doing sometimes, and this is one of the best examples of that very thing working very well. If you've got a spare half hour, you and your headphones have your work cut out for you, because this is a very good use of it. Westside Gunn, Flygod is an awesome god too. After his last release only a few months ago at this point, Griselda collective member Westside Gunn had things looking up for him for the most part. This contains some of his best, most diverse, well-written, and well-produced tracks under his huge catalog spanning quite a few projects. But this did seem like a rushed release on Flygod 2 for a few reasons before even getting into it. With it only being a couple months after his last project, how good of a set of tracks can you really serve up in that amount of time? That's very debatable, and it does also kind of seem like it might be capitalizing off of the success of his last album. You might want to get something out there in the world as quickly as possible. But either way, I highly doubted it was going to live up to Pray for Paris, and especially wouldn't take the steps I thought necessary in order to make a good album like that into a great one. And for the most part, this isn't really any better or worse than the usual project from Gunn, and feels like a sequel to Pray for Paris more than it does the first Flygod, ironically. This is another helping of classic sounding beats, eccentric ad-libs, and deliveries that follow that eccentric nature, and crack-dealing hardcore lyrics. Overall, your typical affair for him and most of Griselda at this point. That being said, it is definitely kind of a step back from his last release. There are definitely some good moments, but there's far less standout highlights on this album than the previous one, and overall, it's just kind of a vibe. Like, it's likable, but it doesn't have those standout moments, you know? This is far from memorable, but it's pretty smooth to the ears while it's on more oftentimes than not. There's just not a lot to take away from it. It's pretty much just your typical Westside Gunn project. Lianne Havas, self-titled. Lianne's name is not one that I was familiar with and had heard any music from at all, but based on some praises I was hearing of this album, I was very curious to check it out. And I can say with a reasonable amount of certainty, this is not hyped up too much to any degree. In fact, I think it's still a little bit underrated, even if this is one of her most appreciated projects yet, and you should definitely go check it out if you haven't heard about it already. This collection of 12 emotive singer-songwriter tracks cut right to the core of your emotions through Lianne's beautiful singing voice. While that is certainly the centerpiece of the record, the instruments are all usually pretty stripped back, but perfectionistic nonetheless. Her lyrics about love and a multitude of emotions are impactful and usually pretty straight to the point. They wouldn't have this much impact without her, again, amazing singing voice though. This is also an incredibly consistent listen. 52 minutes is a little long for an album, but it really does not feel long at all when each song is pretty much just as good as the last one before it. And 5 minutes per song is also a little bit long on some of the longer cuts here, but when they're as entertaining as they are on this album, that doesn't feel like it takes too long to be over with either. Also, love the Weird Fishes Radiohead cover. This is very much a good cover because she makes it her own a bit and still makes it a very compelling track. All things considered, this is definitely worth your time if you're into more lavish pop singer-songwriter type music. It's a very consistent listen, and it was so consistent that it was very difficult to pick favorites and least favorites. Blu and Exile, Miles. I also had not heard of the duo that is Blu and Exile. I hadn't heard any of their previous projects or any solo work or separated from this duo things that they had done in the past. And I had heard a lot of praises, especially for this album, but of course at an hour and a half I was a little skeptical that this would be a good listen all the way through. You can only keep me engaged for so long. The old school hip-hop stylings of Exile's production, with Blu rapping over it with a killer flow and killer wordplay, instantly captivated me though. His lyricism kept me interested all the way through this journey of a record as well. He says incredibly clever things and constantly has this quality that just feels real about his lyrics. The way Blu talks about his life struggles and even huge issues outside of himself is entertaining and simultaneously impactful. The way he even explores all the clever things that his name means to him is extremely likable. He's clearly a very underappreciated MC with some of the best bars and flows of the year, no doubt about it. He really brings this vintage hip-hop style to life. Exile's production on here is lush and dense, sample heavy, really smooth on the ears, and has an experimental edge to it that brings a lot to the table. The features that they bring on here does the little bit of an extra mile that they really needed in order to keep this interesting all the way through. They were all clearly very well chosen and do perform very well on this record. And one of the most rewarding things is how concise and specific each song topic is. Every single song on this very long album does feel like it has a point. There's not really any filler here because they don't really exist outside of themselves on the album. Overall, this is a huge time investment as far as albums are concerned, but it's one that's extremely rewarding nonetheless. Oliver Tree. Ugly is beautiful. Oliver Tree's new record is nothing new for him, down to a literal sense of the word. I'm pretty sure this is the third time tracks Alien Boy and Hurt have been released. So clearly, before we even talk about the quality of the music, this album rollout is a mess. And that's something that's out of his control, so I won't fault Oliver to that degree, but it does dampen the experience of the album that some of this has been rehashed and already released. There's not a lot of actual new content on this album. If you know about Oliver Tree to this point, there's not a lot to explain. He's a goofy, eccentric character that has catchy, ironic tunes, playing into styles of rap, pop, emo, pop punk blends, kind of riding the emo trap wave on and off. And that's a lot of what you're getting into on here. Fun tracks that are a little emotional but equally corny and ironic, nostalgic riffs, catchy songwriting, and the loner outcast weirdo narrative that he's always been spinning. From emo trap to faithful recreations of 2000s pop punk, there's a lot on here, something for everyone, and it's just pretty likable no matter who you are. Most of the styles are going to appeal to the majority of people. There's also pretty much no consistency on this album. Each one doesn't really feel like it ties into the last in any way, and for the most part it is kind of more taking a mixtape tone to things because, like I said, a lot of this was already released. But if you haven't heard Oliver Tree's music yet, this is probably the best hopping on point, and there is a lot to love here, and I have loved a lot of these songs already. The Kid LAROI. Fuck love. I've heard the Kid LAROI being called a ripoff of both Post Malone and former collaborator Juice WRLD, rest in peace, and while I can see both of those things, a lot of people are those things. And he is a kind of fun blend of the two. The only thing that bothers me about this tape isn't the copycatting or how typical his style is at this point, but how the album more or less depicts him as a total cheating asshole, and then somehow he's the one saying fuck love. It seems kind of douchey and problematic, but maybe that's just me. Except for the fact that in format, it's also kind of a direct ripoff of Goodbye and Good Riddance, right down to the skits. That was a little hard to ignore too. Yeah, not super tasteful. He is pretty much just melodramatically rapping and riffing over some acoustic guitar trap beats across this thing. It's your typical emo trap album. So if you like that, you'll probably like this too. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. He doesn't really do a lot better or worse than most of the people in the game doing that right now. And the fact that he's pretty similar to everyone else doesn't at all stop this from having likable moments. LAROI's choruses are often super catchy and have the same emotional quality you'd be expecting, and it's honestly a good sign that he's compared to Posty so much, because he has always come up with some slick, flowing deliveries in his aesthetic, and the fact that LAROI is using a similar format really makes the music more likable. So it's definitely not original, but it's not bad either. There's a lot of likable moments. I'd much sooner listen to Convolk, Ian Dior, somebody else who's coming up. But if you're gonna go listen to some of the emo trap movement that's still going on, you could definitely do a lot worse than this. Blade 333. So if you are one of the people who's been around here for a little while, you might know that I'm one of the poor souls who puts their life on the line in order to defend Blade every time he drops a project. And with how much he's been releasing, yeah, it's that time of the month again. And with me being unironically a fan of this, especially on this album, my head is spinning trying to come up with how to critique it. So on here, he kind of dipped away from the typical sound and style for him on a couple different tracks, and he kind of tried to make bangers. On these and even some of the others here, I end up enjoying it ironically so hard that it becomes completely unironic, and I just can vibe with it, absolutely. The charming inflection and accent is really present on this record and super noticeable, more so than often. If you hate that, you'll hate this, but I find it to add some personality to his robotic delivery. Lyrically though, it's really hard to get behind most of the shit he's saying on here, but I've for the first time ever legitimately recognized that this is probably not even his first language, so I guess there's that. Maybe I can't even fault him for it. Production is really nothing you wouldn't expect. Very digital and dreamy, sending you to some futuristic love dimension or some crazy shit like that. It's weird, but at this point it's pretty Blade standard. I do recognize he's trying a few new things here and there, and some particularly good oddballs do pop up, but some bad ones stand out as well, and it makes it a pretty versatile listen. I'd call this one of his most diverse and unique projects to date, so maybe if you haven't liked some of his stuff before this point, do give a couple tracks a listen, but at the end of the day, I don't really see this converting to many people. It's a Blade record, do with it as you will. Inlet. Rockers Hum are back at it for the first time in 22 years for their 8-track epic that is Inlet. I meant to cover this one last month, but it kind of worked out since this month was kind of dry anyways, and there were a lot last month. And I put it at the end of this video just because we can procrastinate it to the absolute max potential that way. Somewhat fittingly too, because this does feel like the musical embodiment of procrastination. They usually seem to just kind of pick a riff, drum rhythm, and monotone vocal tone and stick heavily to that for the entire long song. It's certainly more diverse than something like a drone metal album, and it's kind of a blend that is reminiscent of your typical post-grunge band. And if you're anything like me, you'll know that procrastination is one hell of a vibe. you'll also know that it builds and builds until it's overwhelming sometimes. Both are true of this record as well. Also, stylistically, this sounds straight out of the 90s post-grunge wave. So if you wanted them to just keep making albums back then, this would have been the next logical step. I think it's mostly the tuning of the guitars and the vocal style, but it's pretty familiar even to me, even though I haven't listened to a lot of that style of music, but it's very familiar and somewhat nostalgic. I'd certainly call this album too long though. It drags its feet quite a bit and doesn't focus entirely, but it does have a really cool aesthetic. It's also somewhat lacking in consistency. Each song feels pretty separated and not much of a conclusion is present on this album either. But I can't really picture this getting called a disappointment either. If this type of music is up your alley, this will 100% not let you down. I'm fairly confident in saying that. So that is all we're going to cover for this month's recap. If I did miss anything, make sure to let me know in the comments below, because I would be happy to go check that out for you, give it a listen, tell you what I thought, and report back, give it a little bit of a rating down there and everything. So if there's anything else you wanted me to cover from this last month, or even the month before it if I didn't cover it in the previous recap, then go ahead and let me know down there. But like the video if you did like what you saw today, and subscribe to the channel for more music related content coming your way. Hit the bell notification on that very same thing as well. But that is just about going to wrap it up for this one, and I will see you in the next video.